Welcome to part 2 of Windows Server History. Now, if you remember in part 1, we stopped that video. We were talking about Windows Server 2000, specifically Windows 2000 Professional, the dedicated client system for Windows Server 2000. And that was in February of 2000. Well, in April of 2003, Microsoft released Windows Server 2003. They did some pretty major enhancements to Active Directory. They introduced the idea of secure by default, meaning that when you installed the server, nothing was working. It was running just enough to be running. You didn't have all the services. You didn't have a web server, all that stuff running. Microsoft had marketed before this that the server was very easy to set up. It had all this functionality working out of the box. That quickly became a security risk. There were a lot of security breaches, and so Microsoft began to lock this thing down. And secure by default is the result. Many of the features and roles are disabled by default. You have to turn them on if you want them. In April 2005, Microsoft started a trend they're still doing today. They released another version of Windows Server 2003, but instead of calling it 2004 or 2005, they called it R2 or Release 2. This is also known by a lot of people as Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 1. Now, this was the first Windows Server product that you could get a 64-bit version. So just keep that in mind. It was Windows Server 2003 Release 2 was our first 64-bit version. In February 2008, Windows Server 2008 was released. Active Directory was renamed to Active Directory Domain Services. Now, there were a lot of extensions and improvements to Active Directory, but it's still the same basic functionality, the same basic architecture, and it's just a strong, powerful security system. Windows Server 2008 R2 was released later in 2008, and this was the first operating system for the server from Microsoft to be shipped only in a 64-bit version. So if you want a 32-bit Windows Server operating system, you have to go back to Windows Server 2008, not R2, but the standard Windows Server 2008. There is a 32-bit release on that, but starting with 2008 R2, it's all 64-bit. Then that brings us to September 2012. Windows Server 2012 is released. There's a new Active Directory Administrative Center introduced. We'll talk about that later. Active Directory and Windows Server 2012 can now be stopped and started like any other service. You couldn't do this before, and it was a hassle. Now, in Server 2012, Microsoft continues to enhance Active Directory's maintenance functionalities. They also focus on security and large-scale management. So Windows Server 2012, I mentioned it somewhere else in the course here. It's not a big revolutionary thing. It's a continuation of the evolution of a very strong, basic, fundamental server system that Microsoft's been developing since 1992. So that's the basics on the Windows Server history. This will help you look like you've been around a while, look like you may be smarter than you are with folks around the water cooler at work, but it can also help trigger things on the exam to help you choose right answers on a few of the questions anyway. So that's a quick look in 2 parts at Windows Server history.